Hello and welcome to part 2 of our analysis of Berserk. In the first part, we covered desire, the desire of the other, neuroticism, and perversion as they relate to Griffith and Guts. In this part, we'll be going over the phallus, trauma, abjaya, and the behelit.
How does the phallus show up in Berserk? I think this is one of the core psychoanalytic concepts in the show.
If you are familiar with the phallus, or at least know its definition, as its common sense definition, not its psychoanalytic definition, as a penis or a penis-like object, phalluses abound in Berserk, and particularly, Guts' sword is incredibly phallic. And there's also one of my favorite scenes where Guts separately, I think on top of a roof this time, at night, he's having his monologue. He has his sword between his legs and he's thinking about Griffith. Literally, he's imagining Griffith with his hair flowing. He's thinking about Griffith's dream and whether he is worthy of committing himself to Griffith's dream or committing himself to anything. But by the end of that monologue, he says, "There's one thing I'm sure of." And he lifts his sword up between his legs and he says, "I will wield my sword for Griffith till the very end." And he's got this huge phallic thing in between his legs. And so he literally gets a hard-on for Griffith. I think that's interesting. But psychoanalysis would warn us against such interpretations. Psychoanalysis says that the phallus is not the penis. Perhaps it's better understood as the patriarchy. But what it actually is a signifier. It's our entryway into the symbolic in general, or it's the capacity to manipulate the symbolic. And so if you wield the phallus, then you are in some sort of position of power. You're able to decide the terms of the engagement, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think I really want to highlight one of the things that you said that I think should be said really clearly, that for psychoanalysis, the phallus is not the penis, but is more like the patriarchy, insofar as what structures patriarchy is not biological malehood, but is about the social and symbolic category of man. And so the phallus is not the object, but is the symbolized object, the power associated with social hierarchy and with power. So an example of a phallus operating socially is like a judge. When a judge says, I now pronounce you man and wife, or you're going to prison for 20 years, that carries, symbolic weight. That's not just a thing that a person said, but that's a legally binding action. And the phallus is this symbolic power. And so where the phallus actually shows up in Berserk is not in these massive penis swords, but is in the pervasive social violence of hierarchy that totally penetrates the story of Berserk and governs the logic of all the characters.
Yeah. I think also really important is to understanding the phallus is that it operates through a veiling. An interesting way of observing the phallus, or not observing the phallus, is the way Griffith wields the phallus. In Griffith's case, I think one of his most potent phalluses, which he keeps veiled, is his dream. At any moment embodied by the behelit or by Griffith's articulation of a dream, which it remains veiled till the very end. It's never specified, and yet it holds this power over people. Griffith's dream, he's able to manipulate the social field. He almost has like this Steve Jobs-esque reality distortion field. I think this is a good time to read this quote from Carolyn J. Dean from her work The Self and Its Pleasures, Bataille, Lacan, and a History of the Decentered Subject. At the same time, because the phallus is a signifier, that is, because it is a part of a relational linguistic system, it is not the truth about sexual difference. Instead, it represents a truth about the constructedness of sexual difference that is always, in Lacan's word, veiled. So for Lacan, patriarchy no longer functioned as the foundation of truth, but instead an anchor of cultural fictions. And so I think with this quote, we can also get into, I think, Casca's very interesting relationship with the phallus and the show in general, in the way that it is sort of gender bending and a critique of the social constructedness of sexual difference, as Carolyn explains. But the phallus is not evidence of this essential quality of power inherent to the penis. Instead, it is evidence of this constructed quality of power that is, by its constructed nature, inherent to the penis. It's this cultural, historic development, I guess.
In a social relation of power that is wielded throughout the show. I think that's one of the things that is really apparent in the show, is the show keeps a really close eye on patriarchal violence in all of its different forms. The show even opens with a really extended scene of patriarchal torture.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, it's the scene in the pub where that woman is being tormented by those guys. I wanted to speak about Casca and her relationship to the phallus, and I think there is a serious feminist critique here in Berserk of how masculinity is an inherently sort of wounded subject position. The heart of masculinity is empty. Again, always contesting for power. There's always this demand to contest for power. But Casca finds herself in a similar contest, as a lot of women do in society. Maybe not so much in that time period. I think that women were very much simply relegated to victims of phallic power. Casca is, I think, a great analog for women in the corporate space, or women who find themselves surrounded by phallus-wielding men, or the only way they can attain any sort of social movement is by masquerading that they do in fact wield the phallus. And Casca has this really poignant line when she pretty much is struggling because she has her period during an important fight, right? And so she's woozy, and she's totally out of it, and she ends up actually putting her own life on the line because of that, because she's not in tip-top physical shape. She's constantly berated by the men in her group about, that's why women shouldn't be in the battlefield because of weakness, inherent weakness. But anyway, by the end of all that, after Guts saves her and whatnot, Casca yells at Guts because Guts is again berating her for being a woman.
Be thankful that you are just a woman, or I dislocate your jaw. I don't like it at all. Women have no place playing at being knights. You get angry too easily, and you're irrational. That's why a woman shouldn't be allowed on the battlefield. What?
I didn't choose this. I didn't. I never asked to be born a woman.
A very powerful statement from Casca.
I think this is also what connects Guts and Casca, is that their relationship to the phallus is not one that is desiring to covet it and to control the phallus, but a defensive relationship to the phallus. And it makes them equals, and I think is ultimately what fosters their love and connection for each other, which I think is one of the things that really also threatens his relationship with Griffith, is when he fights for her, and he really questions, what do I fight for when he's fighting?
I just think it's really interesting that so many characters have this sexual trauma that they're dealing with. Guts not so much.
No, Guts does as well. Guts was also, in the show it's more implied, I think, than in the manga, where it's very explicit. But in the show, his father sells him to another mercenary.
Yeah, all the characters have this sort of sexual trauma. They've fully confronted the violence of the phallus and its imposition, not just on them as symbolic subjects, but on their body and the violence that it commits to their bodies. And they're all sort of continuously responding to that trauma, even though perhaps they don't acknowledge it always.
Yeah, I loved that you named trauma in that, because I think that that's such an important part of the story that does not get talked about a lot, is how traumatized all these characters are. And what is traumatizing is this phallus, this intrusive, violent, social inequality and hierarchy that's being imposed sexually on these characters. Their early formative sexual experiences are violating. For Guts, it is being betrayed by his father and sold out. For Griffith, it is selling himself to this noble for money. For Casca, it is, fighting for her life against sexual slavery. And they all, I think, respond to the trauma of phallic power differently. Griffith wants to, take up phallic power for himself and to, become the rapist. Guts chooses to abandon society and to choose, violence as a defense against the violence that he suffered. And Casca also chooses defense, but wants protection as well as defense, and so is tied to both Guts and Griffith in this way.
Guts and Casca in particular are unable to engage in any sort of sexuality. I think they have sexual desire. Maybe not Griffith, though. I mean, I think he's just like a fucking American Psycho Bateman type character. I know Casca, toward one of the later episodes, she says,
That's why we cling to one another, to our dreams, to a word of comfort, to a strict command. I yearned for someone to be close to for so long.
and it's clear that she's been unable to make her so vulnerable, just like Guts. I think that's where they find their relation, is like you were mentioning, they've put up these defenses so high in different ways. I mean, Casca has devoted herself to something, and Guts is whatever the opposite of that is annihilated all devotion to anything. So tragic too. Casca is killed so soon after her and Guts finally connect on a romantic level and like see each other as equals. But now at this point, I think we can, using the behelit, we can talk about the end and how all of this sort of comes to a head, because those are developments, but they all get annihilated at the end. Again, we're assuming you watch the show, so you know what the behelit looks like. It's this red, blood red rock. The third to last episode, the eye, which is like on this side of the rock, and the mouth, which is on the other side of the rock, they come together into a face which cries blood and screams. I was just thinking what you think about the behelit and its aesthetics, and if that you think contributes to anything at all. I do think it's interesting that it looks the way it does.
I think it highlights this sort of pure evil. Like, I think it's meant to be something which is of the demon world. Like, it's not of the material world that they all exist within. And so I think it's really interesting. I think it's like a Lovecraftian item because it exists as this sort of unnameable thing, this, excessive object of reality that is more real than reality, sort of shatters everyone's conception of the world. And it's sort of almost like it's an object of desire, and it is that object, it is that lack in the world. But it's also its own grotesque body without organs. It is this horrible potentiality-making machine that takes people, sacrifices them, and then transforms Griffith into essentially a demon monster, Femto.
Yeah, I like what you said about the body without organs, because I was thinking a similar thing. Not particularly body without organs, but just the way that it is a face. I mean, it's clearly a face, but it's this disorganized face, which, and the demon world in general, I mean, you look at any demon in the show, they aren't this concealed vampiric entity. They aren't this masked threat. They're this totally disorganized conglomeration of body parts. I mean, almost like Wicked City 2, and a lot of, I think, particularly Japanese depictions of demons are these absolutely grotesque, disorderly flesh things, right? Yeah, I would agree that the behelit is sort of this disorganizing principle of the psyche. Whether you call it the drive, I don't know, or the death drive, but something that tends towards disorganization, excess. Yeah, it's interesting because Griffith is an incredibly organized and efficient person. Never missteps until that one episode. And yet his destiny is this infinitely evil, disorganizing principle. The highest court of evil. They themselves are beholden to some drive or some desire, this enjoyment. They can't help but enact violence.
They're obeying like their own nature. They're yes. Totally faithful to their nature as beings of pure evil. It's very interesting too. They bind him into like a pact, which I think is interesting. Like they create almost like a new deal. And in that way, it's like an apocalyptic covenant that they create with Griffith.
But, I think if you were to read it in a simplistic way, perhaps the show is telling us that, like, undergirding the true nature of reality or the true nature of man is this inherently violent and disorganized, instinctual animal. But I think a more nuanced understanding is that only becomes manifest through an organized symbolic structure, through an absolute commitment to a dream. Yeah, it's interesting that it's Griffith's noble cause that becomes so perverted in the very end. Why is it that Griffith, the most ethical character, supposedly becomes the most perverted, evil character? And I don't think it's necessarily good versus evil in a binary way, but it's more of a dialectical relationship between the moral code, social order, rationality, and its flip side, its necessary flip side, which is, according to the show, evil.
Yeah, Griffith isn't, like, the one thing where I'd push back on you a little bit is that Griffith's an ethical character. Like, I think that he has no ethics whatsoever, and that's what is able to push him to follow his desire so faithfully. And what attracts the God Hand to him is he has no mooring in any of the social, fabric.
Although, to me, there is a binding that's necessary for Griffith, whether it's a binding to his own dream or, in the end, a binding to this natural evil, this law of evil in the end. Yeah, that's an interesting question, whether Griffith is ethical or not. But either way, I do think that the behelit is this sort of, it's of the world, it exists in the world, and yet it is from the underworld. It's sort of this bridge between the two, and Griffith wears it. But I do think that it represents this, the way like social codes and the symbolic has this obscene, violent, this necessary, obscene, violent underside that is inescapable, that defines every one of us and as subjects, that we can't escape. Griffith is able to access it so purely because he's so committed.
I think too, like, his relationship to violence here, I think, is really informative, because he accumulates all this social power through his violence.
Yeah.
And so underneath all this social power fundamentally rests violence, which is what I think connects him to the God Hand, is because of his quest for power through violence, he's brought into connection with otherworldly evil.
Yeah, because I was going to say, it's not necessarily like the commitment that draws the behelit to him. Because in his monologue to the princess about what makes someone an equal, he goes on and on about, like,
one man's dream can hold dominion over the entire world. For one who dedicates his life to the forging of a single sword. While many can pursue their dreams in solitude, other dreams are like great storms blowing hundreds, even thousands of dreams apart in their wake. Dreams breathe life into men and can cage them in suffering.
And I think it's that particular kind of dream, at least according to the show, that attracts the behelit, and this evil is this commitment or this desire that revolves around power, like you were saying, as opposed to a man who's devoted to God with all his life or devoted to forging a sword. It's the man or the person who is seeking, who doesn't believe in anything, right? Who has who only believes in themselves.
And is invested in violence as a way of life. Like, I think that's part of why Guts gets out of it, is because he is so invested in violence, he's able to escape. And him and Griffith are the only two to come out of it.
It's true. I think it's interesting too, and this is more particularly in reference to the manga, but because in the manga, Guts' first trials and tribulations revolve around various people in power who also happen to be demons. who are revealed to be demons only after Guts challenges them with his sword. Over and over again, he encounters governors, counts, in positions of power and are incredibly sadistic to their underlings and their subjects. And he ends up fighting them. They all turn out to be demons. So it's clear that the God Hand seeks out those in power, those in control of the symbolic order, or those who have symbolic status, to do their bidding.
To add to that, all of these demons that have been put into positions of power have been put into positions of power by Griffith. He is putting demons in charge of kingdoms. That's sort of where we find Guts, like, at the chronological end of the story. In the manga, the story continues on much longer. But what I want to focus on is primarily like the show. And in the very beginning of the show, we actually get the very end sort of the chronological story, where Guts is tracking down Griffith by trying to kill his way through all of his demons and up his sort of chain of command.
But yeah, I don't know. I'm still seeing the behelit as an acknowledgement by the show of the inherent brutality of the symbolic order, the flip side of the law. The behelit and the underworld and demons are the result of the law, in a sense. Not opposed to the law, but very much a part of it. It's obscene underbelly.
Yeah. And I think because a part of that underbelly is violence. Like these demons exist within the violence of this world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that this disorganizing principle inherent to the ostensibly very organized symbolic order, this disorganized face, this fragmented body, these fragmented bodies, this disarticulation of either your body or your symbolic identity, as always being a threat, and always being there. It's like a behelit wrapped around your neck. You always got it there, and you can't really avoid it.
Should we wrap it here?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if you want any closing statements. I mean, I
think it's a masterpiece. I think it's a queer masterpiece. If you're here at the very end, you're one of the real ones. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.
That's right. Thank you for watching again, and we'll catch you in the next episode.